Good evening. Working? All right. I know. Yeah, but it won't pick up in the system without this.
Didn't turn it on.
So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the meeting this evening. Again, I hope everybody had a great holiday last weekend. I know we're pushing into the holiday season now, and Kim will go through some issues related to the schedule. We'll talk about that later on in the meeting, figure out where we're at and what kind of commitments we can secure to move forward over the course of the next month. Brian, as I mentioned, is delayed. He is on his way, and we're waiting on Mark Burke, who is the new building commissioner, so he should be joining us shortly as well. This evening we have Kevin Howard and Lee Eidsweiler on from Austin. It's our intent to start to talk about the code, specific provisions of the code. I'm going to have Kim describe the materials that you have before you, and then Lee and Kevin are going to take us through a discussion of those items. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead and describe what you have.
So I think the only thing that we handed out today was a draft of the mixed-use districts, and specifically we're looking at the traditional districts today. So that's the only thing we've handed out, and I think that's it.
I'm gonna so these we've seen these before. We've seen them over the last several months. However, there were comments made to these. They were sent back to the consultant. The consultant worked those comments in to this version. So this ostensibly, though, is the first time I think that this portion, the traditional districts, have been distributed. But we're going to start with the suburban stuff. Is that right, Lee?
Yeah, no, that would be great. Let's start with suburban. That way we can, we still have some capacity to look at the traditional stuff so we don't get too absorbed in their materials.
Okay, go ahead.
Great. Should I get started on this?
Yes, please.
Okay. So you guys saw this page before. Rezoning shopping center. So there's this kind of this clean split between the suburban and the traditional. And I want to talk about some of the suburban concepts.
So Kevin, just wait, hang on a second. So let me be clear. You do not have this material. We don't have this material yet. So the traditional district we'll talk about after we talk through the suburban. So don't worry about having this in front of you. Just listen to what you said. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, so I guess the goal of this is to go over the concepts and the approach to suburban districts, so make sure everybody's on board, so that we can pursue writing the districts. The traditional is a little easier in that there's kind of a clear structure to that you've inherited from kind of the historic grid that was there, and traditional has some benefit from that, where suburban kind of is lacking a couple of those elements that make the zoning for it really easy. So suburban districts. The conditions on the ground are that suburban centers, corridors, are organized around wide, really high-speed roadways. There's a lack of street network that you have in traditional areas that provides access off of those high-speed roadways. So in order to get commercial access from those fast roads, like Sheridan Transit, you give up on safety. A lot of turning motions on the high-speed roads are really dangerous, and so that's kind of the struggle with a lot of the suburban arterials. Which are poorly connected.
Kevin? You're breaking up here. So
Okay.
I don't know if there's anything you can do on your end, but it's definitely breaking up here.
Okay.
Are you drinking?
Should I start over?
No, I don't think so. Just if there's something you can do to adjust yourself or the microphone or whatever, if there's anything you think you can do, it's just breaking up here.
Okay. Let me know if it continues to break up. I'll try just speaking slower. Maybe that'll help.
Yeah, you're sounding good right now.
Sounding good?
Yeah.
All right. So like I was saying, on those high-speed arterials, you're compromising safety for access to these commercial centers and corridors and all the, the commercial properties along them. Centers and corridors, they're really poorly connected. They tend to be really like large-scale coarse grain development that are isolated in access and really only have, for the most part, really only have those connections to the rest of the city through the longer street. And for the most part, a lot of these suburban areas are lacking an identity of place. The experience is primarily of your car and the roadway to get there, and then of the parking lot. The interior of the building, there's not much of a place or a human scale oriented space. There's also a lack of mixed-use living and working options, and kind of a reliance on getting in your car to go to lunch if you're working in the area, or getting in your car to go to the corner store even. In that kind of lack of connection and lack of options associated with the commercial properties, you have a lack of mobility options and lack of connections from the neighborhoods into those areas. So it's really very unsafe for a child to go to the corner store. So part of this is kind of the divergence from the concept of a road and the concept of a street. Back in the day, we had roads, whether it was railroads or highways, that connected us from A to B. And then we had a network of streets, like you see main streets and kind of neighborhood collectors and things, that created value off of those things, not to ruin safety and speed along those roadways, but to create value in the community on streets and places. Value of creating access. So we kind of saw a massive, rapid spread of commercial development that's primarily single use and primarily auto dominated. So the goal of the suburban districts would be to improve safety along major roadways and improve the experience along major roadways. And then really the fundamental part of this is to create a framework within the district for safe connectivity and access, but also promote places for people within those centers, not just experiencing parking lots, but experiencing, having a place to park your car, but also a place to go that is people-oriented. And along with that framework, creating a structure for incremental change over time. So here's the concepts for the different districts right now. We have some conditions that are shallow corridors. Generally, we see these as less than 200 feet deep. Deep corridors that are greater than 200, but probably less than 500 feet. And then there's centers that are large and over 500 feet deep. You can see, this is kind of a diagram to show you there's generally this arterial, this high-speed roadway that it's connected to, and then the concept here is to create a framework of access. You can see in gray on the shallow corridor that kind of is a framework for development along that to consolidate access points, create shared access and safe connections to these parcels. And then the deep corridor, you get the combination of that in addition to real street connections and blocks, and then a requirement for a build-to or development on one side of the street. So you essentially end up with kind of a half-street condition. On the corridor side, with deep arterial and high-speed streets, there's no requirement. That's more of your suburban edge. And then you come into that access and you have development along the edge. In the sense,
Kevin?
Sorry?
So what we're seeing right now are 3 rectangles with some blue lines through the deep corner in the center. There's nothing else, no other annotation to the slide.
Yeah, it's just a diagram. We'll go through this in detail. It's just a conceptual framework.
Okay.
But generally, the darker gray is a street, and the lighter gray is alleys or cross-access, and the blue is signifying some sort of development.
We're not picking up any of the gray tones.
Okay, that's fine. We'll get there. The narrower gray strips are circulation elements, and the wider gray strips are the road elements.
I think they're blue ones.
So what I did to kind of break into what these concepts mean, I took something that I have on the ground that's mapped, has a corridor that's shallow. I took a deep corridor, and I put these standards on those districts to see what they look like in real life. So the first example we have is Sheridan and Millersport. Really shallow commercial along Sheridan. Turns the corner to Millersport. Then you can see the residential district behind it. I'm actually going to focus on the north side of the road and not the south. Kind of a complex condition here is you can see some of the parcels actually have purchased up residential lots and extend all the way through the block. You can see this from above really easily, where you have kind of standard residential parcels, and some of them are kind of eaten away by the commercial parcels and caught some death. You can also see Sweet Home on the left. At this portion of Sweet Home, it's considered a local street, and so the way that it's split might be different than these other two primary arterials. So this is kind of an analysis that shows, they show you where all the driveways are. We were talking about kind of uncontrolled turning on and off of these high-speed roads as safety along them. Luckily here on Sheridan you have a median that helps protect from a lot of the uncontrolled turns, but it's still, along that road, it's still going to be relatively unsafe due to the frequency and the width of those conflicts, and also the lack of control within them. You can see they're kind of scattered. Part of this would be implementing access management strategy, which would be to say that driveways have to be at least this far apart. They're going to be part of a shared access network that includes a backage road. This can be seen as like an alleyway. The placement of that backage road and the connection to these shared access points is critical for development to have safe access, and enough distance from that high-speed roadway for the turning movements to be controlled. You can see that the distance from or before an intersection and the distance after an intersection might be different numbers, and that has to do with the functional area of the intersection. The traffic engineers might call this upstream and downstream intersections, but they'll have different metrics associated with them. There's also this minimum separation in general, so you don't have a driveway up 50 feet with people turning on and off kind of sporadically. You can see how these circles kind of represent access points. Every parcel still has access off of this backage road. There's you have your controlled right in, right out, and you also have a left in at the midpoint there, where the median breaks. Having a constant placement of that cross-access easement is really critical. Otherwise, currently you have a requirement for stubbing out or cross-access, but the location isn't controlled, so having kind of a continuous framework is almost impossible on a parcel-by-parcel basis. And that's why by having kind of a more district-wide approach to cross-access placement is going to be critical for getting a better framework for access and a better framework for incremental development. I wanted to talk about a couple other things with the shallow corridor and the placement of this cross-access easement. Partially, so part of it is that the distance. You can see the minimum, maximum distances from the street, And those might change based on the functional classification of the roadway, but this is kind of just to formalize where that cross-access is supposed to go. It's already required, but it's formalizing it. And what this is going to do is it's going to make it so, you have a safer Sheridan and kind of a better connectivity between the parcels, so you're not having to come up onto Sheridan and off of Sheridan every time you go to a place. You'll also notice that because this is determined to be a shallow corridor, the placement of that cross-access actually splits some of the deeper lots. And this kind of shows you something that, perhaps this was the right approach to begin with, and that maybe there should have been a different style of development on the north side of this cross-access easement. You could potentially see, residential or multifamily addressing that single-family neighborhood to the north, on the other side of the alleyway, and commercial parcels on the south. There's also some site design elements that I wanted to go over. So this is kind of the epitome of that uncontrolled turn movement and lack of parking screening, lack of streetscape and of pedestrian elements. That, if this were a really busy parking lot, and this would be a really dangerous place to be, especially for pedestrians, but not a particularly safe place for people in cars either. But good news is you already have some standards in place that are getting you better answers to this. You can kind of see this is what we would call a throat, and the depth of this throat is important for, based on the classification of the street, it needs to be deeper or shallower, and it allows more controlled turning on and off of high-speed roadways. What this also highlights is some of the other standards you already have in place, such as parking landscaping, parking screening, and some of these parking room concepts that help create better edges to the parking, which is pretty critical in suburban areas. But I did want to highlight that the standards that you have in place today are parcel by parcel, and they're not from a district-wide perspective, which is critical in getting that continuity of that connection. Right, you're going to have just parking that are connected in random ways across the district if it's not regularized, standardized. So you can see here's maybe the minimum throat depth of kind of that image we saw before, where the parcel on the Sweet Home side of this shallow corridor might have access only from that package street when it comes to Sheridan, because you can't get far enough away from Sheridan before you get access. The parcel on the far right-hand side on Miller's Court actually could, right after that dotted line, could get access to this driveway or to this parking lot. But there would still be that alleyway along the back of edge of the parcel. This is to highlight some of the landscaping issues along the current shallow corridor. This is actually part of that same corridor that we're analyzing right now. This is pretty, I imagine this is pretty uncomfortable as a pedestrian, and it's probably not particularly comfortable as a driver coming on or off of this parking lot or driving by the parking lot. Also, the experience of driving by this place is not very aesthetically pleasing either. But, like I said, you guys have some really good standards in place to give you better parking screen standards and better streetscape standards. One thing we should do is better protect the pedestrian in this environment. Right now, with the trees on the left-hand side and not on the right-hand side, you can see the traffic engineer is saying that the sidewalk is a place that the car might go if it is out of control, which essentially is offering our pedestrians these sacrificial offerings to, the highway. So with what we call a tree lawn or a furniture zone on not only between the parking lot and the sidewalk, but also the sidewalk and the street, you create a better, safer environment for the pedestrian. So there might be some tweaks that we might suggest. I wanted to talk more about the edges. You know, we talked about the transition a little bit last time I was in town. And in these shallow corridors, we're dealing with this shallow transition. This is normally a 10-foot deep with a planted with screens and a 6-foot masonry wall. That's separating from the residential districts behind. And what you'll find actually is this backage road really helps to improve that transition, because not only do you have that 10 feet of evergreen and a block wall, but you also have at least 20 feet of cross-access drive where there's no building. So it's 30 feet, minimum 30-foot setback before you have any structure. So it improves the residential transition. We kind of see the different elements that I'm highlighting here. We've got primary arterials, local streets, and maybe there's a different depth requirement for the landscaping along the parking. There's also the parking landscaping in kind of that parking room concept that you guys already have, as well as parking screening along the backside for the local street. And like I was talking about the residential transition, you can see is that darker green color. And what's hidden in there, because you can't see a masonry wall from the top very well, but there's a masonry wall between the houses and that green band. You can see how the edges of the district are treated in a kind of more sensitive way. This is just a visualization that kind of idealizes the form of the shallow corridor. You can see that rear package road as a cross access shared by everybody, and you can see how there's fewer driveways turning out on the major arterial. And what's really important that I didn't go over too much is we're not over-regulating these shallow corridors, in that we're allowing more flexibility when it comes to building placement. It's really tough to ask a lot of these corridors when we're already asking for parking. These parcels are oftentimes small and constrained enough where just getting their required parking in a reasonable size development pad is a challenge. And so by continuing to be flexible there, as long as we're really getting that key frame, structural change to how access is managed, we're moving these parcels along quite a bit. So I'm moving on to a deep corridor, and you'll notice we don't need to talk about all the concepts in as much depth as I go forward, because there's a lot of the same concepts that are reoccurring. But I will kind of expand upon the new elements that are being added. We're looking at Main and Transit here. See that you guys are only Amherst is only on the upper left-hand side of this roadway. These are deep. You can see a lot of, automobiles parked. You can see these are some very major roadways, and they're suburban in nature. But you notice there's a distinct lack of places for people. There's a lot of places for cars, and that's okay. It's also not a strong strategy for connecting these places. It's isolated pods of development. But you can see this starts, the newer development has begun to do some access management. There's not as frequent of parking, frequent of driveways, and the distance of the driveways from the intersection have been regulated so it's a little bit safer. This one could use there's a median.
There is a median,
Sorry?
There is a median there, which probably...
Yeah. It's hiding in that sand tone. But I want you to look at the other side of the street. Not that it's great, it's definitely not, but you can see how access is managed in a stronger way. You don't have parking lots just kind of turning right out onto the street, because this is a huge street. It's 9 lanes at the intersection and 7 lanes further in. So this is not a street for access. This is a roadway that should get you from A to B, but it's kind of being compromised for access to these parcels. And part of that is just inherited from a time when transit was a much narrower roadway. And so this parking strategy is totally fine. Now it's not. It's huge. And so doing some access management is going to be critical. But also, with these deeper parcels, there's more opportunity to do a little bit more than, they're not as constrained as the shallow parcels. So I highlighted here's all the concept areas. You can see how we're doing a little bit better near the intersection, but some of these narrower parcels are getting a lot of access, and it's causing a lot of conflict. So here's kind of the same sort of concepts of the access management strategies. So I'll go over that. You can see how you get kind of instead of a package road, you might get a frontage road where development might actually come up to that first access, cross-access easement. On the far left, however, you see where it turns on the main, you actually end up with a little piece of shallow corridor. That should connect into the deeper corridor, but the way it's treated is with that package road that we talked about before. So you have a different district that's more aligned to the shallow corridor district. So as you can see, we have a lot of flexibility in depth, and so having this is a long transit. It's going to continue to be a suburban, auto-dominated place, and you can accommodate that. But remember, when we were looking at those concept diagrams, we talked about a half street, and this is not it's not unlike how a lot of deep corridors are developed today. So here's the access management, minimum distance from transit, and also a maximum distance from transit in order to get that consistent layout of the cross-access easement. You can see where all those dots are occurring. All of the parcels have access, but they can also have access off of this back alley. This might not be a required element, back alley, that you're seeing kind of bordering the residential, but it's likely to occur because on a deep corridor, we might ask that I'm going to actually move it. And we'd be asking for block standard. This wouldn't be the same sort of block standard you would expect in a traditional area, and it's probably larger than you would expect in a center. But getting block standard would say you have to have something of the minimum street section dividing those sections out. But you can see the cross-access easement doesn't need to necessarily be a street or needing a standard, as long as it's creating connections. I'm going to go back. So you can see that we're starting to develop a framework that's consistent across the district. And you can see how we have a street and an alley system that creates those blocks, and include those cross-access easements and shared access points. This is your minimum scope we were talking about previously. And kind of some diagrams that we have done of street section. Most was actually created for this purpose, the internal street for centers actually. So there might be some difference to what the standard is for the street, and then we can probably do one for alley or whatever the requirement is for that. And then you can see how we might measure block perimeter. So you have a maximum block perimeter, and you might also have a maximum block length. And this can be extended if you provide an alley. You can have a bigger block with an alley, and you can possibly have a longer block with pedestrian passage through the middle of it. So that these concepts are really about improving on connectivity and making sure we have a strong network for development on these parcels. And you can see, so I know you've seen these pages before last time I was in town, but on the deeper lots, you also get a deeper transition. So this is evergreen shrubs and large deciduous trees on 20 feet of depth. And if you were to get that alleyway, which I'll show you, if you were to get that alleyway, that means you're at about 40 feet of separation from those residential parcels. I also want to point one more thing out about this rear alleyway that kind of highlights the benefit of the block standard. That it is really about connectivity, and you can imagine that if this neighborhood really were interested, we want to have walkable, bikeable connections for this new deep commercial corridor with that has all these new amenities on it. they could easily, by redeveloping a single site, create a street connection, and therefore a whole lot better walkable and pedestrian access to these areas from the neighborhood. Wouldn't be possible without that alleyway or a significant stub out to the neighborhood. So also along this, you start to see we're in the shallow corridor. We weren't asking for much for building placement. We knew they're already constrained. It was, it's hard to get parking on there. So in the deeper corridor, you start to see a requirement for development along that cross axis. So this is where you get that half street. You get free movement across the whole district, and you also get buildings aligning to that district. That cross axis would include cars and also streetscape and sidewalk. So it wouldn't just be a little space between vegetation for to get from one parking lot to the other. It's really almost like a street. And what you see, the really great thing about these edges, you see parking, screening, and everything. But we continue to have kind of that suburban out parcel development possible on the primary arterial side that is quintessentially suburban. But you can imagine that over time, if parking standards were to become lower, if demand for parking were as high because of automated vehicles or maybe parking garages become marketable and feasible in your area, you could imagine that the other side of the street could be completed, and you would have kind of that main street set in from the primary arterial that creates a place for people. It's not just about getting good development in these corridors, but it's also about the opportunity for the future through creating this, strong structure. This is kind of a visualization of that. And you can see how this isn't an incredible stretch for a deep parcel. You could imagine that big box being, a gym. You could imagine some doctor's offices and strip malls and things. And you could even imagine that in the suburban out parcel, like Starbucks drive-through. This is pushing beyond where it's capable. It's just making it structured in a way that it can grow and change over time, and it creates safer places for pedestrians and drivers. So the center that I modeled out was Maple and Bailey. I have also done some modeling out of Boulevard Mall, and maybe there'll be more in the future. But for this diagram, it's from Maple and Bailey. You can see it's rather large. We have an actual street right-of-way in the middle here. Boulevard Parkway. So in this section, North Bailey, on the left-hand side here, is in the comp plan is classified as a cluster. In the state DOT classification, it is a minor arterial, and so the way I treated it in this diagram might not be completely accurate. If we're going to base it on comp plan classification, it treats Bailey as a smaller street than it is, rather than being the same as a major arterial that's carrying a bunch of traffic and 5-6 lanes wide. So you might see less parking screening and a different approach to the suburban out parcel. Here's the conflict. You can see that a lot of this is newer. There's already a lot of traffic of access management happening. You can see that off of both Beaumont Street there, you can see there's not access directly on Maple for that corner parcel on the left or on the right. They are really actually doing some access management there. However, I think it's a Wendy's. They have a driveway in either direction, and really, you can see they have clear access from Beaumont Street, and they should probably have access along the internal circulation, rather than having a bunch of driveways along that major roadway. So a lot of the same standards that we were talking about earlier. You can see with the center, we really focus on getting blocks. This is important activity like we talked about before. block standard might be smaller. But you can see that, we're also encouraging the use of alleys rather than driveways, so that you have more controlled access even onto the streets, not just along the arterials, but along these internal core streets. You can see that it was not a stretch to see this in what was already there. There's already what amounts to a street on the right-hand side, and you could really easily imagine that as the parcels redevelop, that along that parcel line, you've got two major parcels on that larger block, that each would build half a street, and you would get the second element. So it wasn't a stretch. It's almost as if the was asking for this block off right now. So you can see here we have smaller blocks. You can see how block 1, 3, 5, 6, and 7 all have alleyways, and they're allowed to be larger, where block 2 and 4 are smaller because they have no alleyways. But block 2 might be the largest block you could possibly get without an alley, where block 1 is probably pushing it with an alley. So there's a lot of concepts in here. So let me kind of walk through it a little bit. The concept with the was to create places for people while also accommodating parking your car. So a suburban area, you need to have those suburban parcels and parking lots. And you can't feasibly build parking structures in Amherst right today. You need to kind of balance those needs. So, what we do is we have our street grid that was created through the blocks, but then there's also a set of core streets. These are the places. They're built through the street section and the streetscape, but also through those frontages. You see them in blue and in yellow. Those are what we are kind of considering right now the walkable frontages. This might be based on a minimum amount of walkable core streets, but there's something that's really important about connecting the centers back into its context. So you can see how the blue and the yellow kind of lead over to the middle school, and they also lead up into the residential neighborhood, so that it creates a very walkable and bikeable connection. You can also see a lot of the same concepts about parking screening, but there's another one that I'd like to point out here that you didn't see in the other ones. In a center, we might also ask that, when a center abuts a residential street, or a street that the other side is a residential district, that you have a residential transition. So rather than just having your parking screened along the street, you might ask that you provide residential development along that street as a frontage. That would have, minimum standards, just like our residential frontage in the additional districts. But one thing that might happen more often in suburban areas is that they are required to phase this in. So the first redevelopment occurs of a certain parcel, and they would actually leave a pad site, essentially, for residential development to happen in the future. This, in the short term, might be a lawn, which is a better transition than just 10 feet of parking screen. So I know that's a lot, and you'll probably have questions about that. This is a visualization that's more of an idealized version of Boulevard Mall. Just so I can model it really quickly with right angles, because in the real world, nothing has right angles, turns out. So you can see how we continue to have flexible building placement, suburban out parcels along the major arterials. You can see that in the corner there, on the left-hand side, we have a taller, maybe a hotel structure that helps anchor this as a place in the region along the major arterials, and that's kind of another way you develop suburban parcels. But we also have kind of the core streets. You can see the quintessential difference between the core streets and the regular streets by looking at the two streets in the bottom left or bottom right hand corner here. One is lined with residential buildings, townhouses on the upper part of it, and maybe small apartment buildings on the lower part. And then one block over, you see just, parking lots green. That green is essentially representing the parking street. So you can imagine the walkable connection that you would get with these, this new neighborhood developing a walkable core street to a critical connection to it that might be a neighborhood just to the lower right-hand side of this center, where walking along that screened parking lot street might not be as encouraging to people walking or biking. But you can see how it's really important that we are stitching the center into its context, rather than just having a drive-to urbanism experience. There's also a couple other things highlighted here.
Kevin, this is Brian Culpa. I've got a quick question here because I didn't see anything in the packet. What are we basing the parking minimums on in this scenario?
I'm sorry?
What are you basing the parking minimums on in this scenario? The minimum required parking?
It's about what we have today.
Okay. I think we got to start with this question.
It's not specifically calculated, but you can also see a lot of this residential is self-parked.
Yeah, we gotta kind of get into this parking minimum, because otherwise we're going to end up with graphics like this, and this isn't going to work out. So somehow we're going to have to get to this pretty quickly.
Catch that, Kevin?
I'm catching a little bit. You might be a bit far away from the mic.
Yeah, I think what Brian's saying is that, that what this calls out really is the need for some attention to the parking standards. Because this probably isn't the form or the density that we're looking for, certainly not the allocation of land area to parking that we prefer to have.
Well, so I didn't model this as the Boulevard Mall specifically, right? This is an idealized version, and it's specifically not the Boulevard Mall, because if we're talking about Boulevard Mall, you might be talking about a transit stop, and the market realities of that are that a lot of the parking can happen in a structure. So hotel may be shared for some of these other elements. And what this does is it gives you the base framework with or without transit.
Yeah, I think what we're saying.
I don't think we're.
I think what we're saying is that the standards that we have today, if those are the ones that we use for this model, are too generous, and we need to rethink those, because there's too much space allocated for parking.
Yeah, and your ratios are very high.
Right.
Yeah, assume those are coming down. I mean, every developer in the area tells us that we're overparked. You can look around town and see that we're overparked. Clearly, we need to drop our parking minimums. But I'm saying that before we go and do any more modeling or any more coding, I think we're going to need to talk seriously about decreasing those. Because, if I see graphics with this much asphalt on the surface, it's going to make me pull the rest of my limited hair out. So we're going to have to get into that quick. I mean, that graphic, I wouldn't want to see that anywhere around town.
Yeah, this graphic also appears to have multi-story.
I thought the mics weren't working. Okay. So this type of graphic, right, with this much asphalt, this parking minimum, and this threshold, we're not going to end up wanting to see this type of pattern anywhere in town. I mean, we may as well just, create little urbanized pods surrounded by a sea of parking. That's not really conducive to what we're trying to get after.
Yeah, I think in this large center, Brian, is that, assuming we're the Boulevard Mall, assume those are all 10-story buildings. You're still going to need what looks like a sea of asphalt to support the verticality of the...
Well, we're still going to need a lot of parking, I'm saying. But the idea of tucking the building mass into the center and then abandoning the arterials you know, with asphalt at the arterial edge, that's not gonna work. We're just gonna have all these little tiny UFO pods around town. This is just, it's not the form and density that I think, you know, I was hoping we'd see in some of this visualization stuff, I guess. I mean, that to me is just abysmal.
Yeah, I want to highlight a couple things. So what's really great about the structure of what we're building here is that once we have parking ratios under control, that, you know, the capacity of the site is amplified, right? We have the bare necessities of having a human-oriented place and connecting to its context. And and based on the block sizes and the minimum streets, it's developing a framework that we can continue to develop and not just asphalt, right? And so we have the framework to support something much better here. It's the reduction of parking. You can move toward that. So yeah, I mean, with lowering the parking ratios would definitely help. The market, especially early on, might just call for really high parking ratios.
We're hearing now that the market is currently calling for decreases in parking ratios. So we know the market's telling us drop your parking ratios currently. So I'm just saying that, we should get into parking ratios soon if we're going to continue to work in this direction, because this is starting to get a little scary.
Brian, it's Lee. This image reflects an idea we have that we need some clarification on. So along a major roadway like Transit, like Niagara Falls Boulevard, etc., we're showing the street that is in the lower left as that major street, and we're showing the edge of that street as being mostly parking dominated. Now, it wouldn't mean the rules forces it to be that. It's just that the applicant would be allowed to do that in trade for the improvement in the internal.
I'm saying that I would reject that outright.
That you would prefer to see both sides of that block have a walkable street on them?
I would rather see the parking internal to the block with walkable faces on both major sides, yes.
We're concerned that your market's not ready for it, but having said that, it's a very simple thing to set the regulations up to apply to both sides of the block.
Based on the conversations that we've had with developers who own similar sized parcels nearby in the same opportunity zone, the market is more than ready for a different density level. So I don't know. I think you're misjudging that a little bit.
I think the other thing to keep in mind here is that this parcel in particular, but generally all of them that front along Maple Road are in fact potentially part of the transit corridor. And so I'm not sure which comes first, whether we plan for the TOD or the TOD comes along and we plan after. Obviously it'd be better to do it ahead of time, but there's some uncertainty related to the project. But this area in particular, along Maple Road, is an area that certainly should be transit ready in terms of the code.
So the rules that we're depicting here do internalize that main street under the impression that we are not going to humanize the immediate edge of the adjacent street. Now, there are some in-between stopping points. For example, in many communities along the big streets, along the southern edge of the lower edge of what you're looking at here, along that big street, you might limit parking to 2 bays and a drive aisle between the building and the street, such that when you got to the actual building, you'd feel more comfortable walking along the face of that building. And the example of that is along Main Street where, I think it's Chico's is, just, you know, basically 2 bays of parking with a drive aisle down the center of them, nice landscaping at the street, and a nice shopping center at the back end.
Dan, you know what the problem is?
Between, you know, it's not trying to make a main street out of every street. Is that a more acceptable pattern?
No. The problem that we have here is that the district we're working in is being categorized as suburban corridor, and this should be traditional corridor. We have an opportunity zone. The state's told us densify here. We're going to basically give you the ability to do that. We're going to add transit to the mass. So within the triangle of the 290 to Niagara Falls Boulevard to Sheridan Drive, it should be traditional. And that's what it comes down to. I've been sitting here trying to wrap my head around this suburban, and that's not the case.
We found ourselves second guessing a number of our earlier decisions when we got to this point. So I don't disagree with you at all. And yes, if you want to commit to this becoming traditional, we definitely could apply the traditional tools, and we would get a very different pattern of development.
Yes, that triangle needs to be traditional. Anything within that triangle.
Okay.
So do you know how the federal opportunity zones work, Lee?
Yes.
All right. So there's a huge tax incentive for developers, and we have 2 major developers in that area, national level developers who self-fund, who are setting up their own opportunity funds for this specific intent. So I think that this has to be our traditional pattern.
Well, happy to change some of those and make a plan amendment at the time we bring the regulations through. So absolutely. And that does cure a lot of the ills that you were looking at. The suburban approach that we're taking then, does it have a place anywhere, Brian?
Yeah, there's properties along Transit Road, Millersport, I would still say. I don't remember what that was.
Niagara Falls Boulevard into the mix, because, I mean, at this point, we talked a lot about the boulevard, transformation of the boulevard.
I don't want to look at that yet. I'm just saying that the concentration of effort here north of Eggertsville, north of Sheridan Drive, you know, it's pretty obvious that wants to be that sort of vibrant student housing mixed-use dynamic. So.
Well, so Brian, I mean, you're right on point with the struggles that we've been having internally. I guess that where we landed, and really what this particular illustration is showing, is that we would get a decent set of blocks. We would get a network of streets within each parcel. We would get to a condition that, you know, could in another future phase, you know, become a much more intense place. But it could start out as a parking lot dominated place that was, you know, totally self-parked in the suburban model. And I guess, I mean, if you're comfortable with it, we would like to kind of finish out the set of regulations associated with this under the presumption that there are at least a few areas in the town that are going to need this kind of a tool.
Yeah, I agree we should continue on this path. I think that rectifying this area will have to be something we have to do in the near future.
Yeah, okay.
Can I ask a question about, just to clarify, if we're doing Niagara Falls Boulevard, how far down on Sheridan and up and down Millersport would this also switch to traditional?
Well, if you look at the opportunity zone, that's a good question, Melissa, because if you look at the opportunity zone, it runs Sheridan all the way to 290. But clearly that wouldn't be the case here. I would say there's probably a stopping point somewhere at Bailey or Sweet Home. Yeah, in fact, Sweet Home seems like it would be the most logical area before you get into the auto world. All right, thanks, Lee.
Okay. So the key elements to this is that we're, you know, managing access, relying on
existing parking and screening and landscaping rules, well embellished on some of it maybe. Creating district-wide frameworks for connectivity, cost access, increment that provides the framework for change over time with reduced parking, and therefore creating the structure for people-oriented places in more places. Using street standards, open space requirements, active frontages to create those places in focused ways, and then also compatibility tools like transitions and requiring those critical connections for the walkable streets. So there's clearly a way forward, I think, even with the suburban center to accommodate more core streets, more active frontages, more urbanism, and maybe even a different edge to the suburban arterials. But I think that this approach, especially for the centers, is going to be needed because the key difference between this and the traditional areas is that traditional areas already have a strong framework of connected blocks of streets to build upon them, so everything is parcel related. So I think if we do kind of go into traditional center with this, it might have to be a hybrid.
Kevin, so if I can right now, what I think what I'd like to do is just ask, maybe Scott and Ellen and Dan and Dal, who are planning board or planning staff that deal a lot with our current planning and development review processes, to maybe comment on access management, the challenges we have with access management. It's a concept that we tried to adopt years ago. It's built into some of the code today. It's a challenge because of the jurisdictional control that some of our highways fall under. But I think it'd be helpful maybe if you guys can just take a minute and describe some of the challenges that we have with trying to implement access management principles with current development that we've seen, or current or recent past development that we've seen. So you're aware of some of the challenges that we have. It's a good organizing principle, but there are challenges here to implementing it.
Lee, I'll take Dan's initiative on here. Daniel Wachowski. My biggest concern is, I like the concept of creating blocks. I guess the issue is, at what point can we compel a landowner to dedicate this area, which creates the initial block, particularly if it's not one big contiguous land area we're dealing with? And what we always see is we have to ask current developers just to leave a stub street adjacent to an interior property line so we can look forward to what may eventually be an interior access road. And I guess, does this just develop organically? I mean, someone's going to have to give up 60 feet of right-of-way, which would then essentially be an internal private street. And that's my question. And, someone's going to have to make the initial step and say, this is where this block is going to start. And you, Mr. Developer, or Ms. Developer, are going to have to commit that right-of-way as a portion of your property. So that's where I'd like to pose that concern.
So a couple of things, actually. I'm not certain that in all cases it needs to be a street. So some of what you were looking at could be internal drive aisles that are, tricked out, in which case they don't take up 60 feet of right-of-way necessarily. And that's probably one of the keys to making this a little more tolerable on the front end. Yes, at a certain scale, we do need a real street. On most of these major roads, you have already put in significant access management through medians. And where those medians exist and where those large-scale entrances exist is clearly, the first target for placing a road actually within the development. Something that might become a public street. But in all cases, the applicant could, as long as they provide passage to their adjacent neighbors and they provide, the equivalent of a pedestrian easement, they could leave these things private. So not not thinking of these as forcing subdivision when an applicant is only looking for site plan approval is really important. So we understand that, I think, and you'll see some of that as you begin to see the actual regulations that goes with this.
Lee, it's Dal Giuliani. As we were going through this and I was looking at particularly the deep corridor, exactly what Dan was talking about came into my mind. If that were to be redeveloped, there probably is a dozen property owners down along that line that would make it virtually impossible to put the block concept in, particularly since they are car dealers who deal with each other and they're not going to put internal road systems in. I mean, the theory is great, and when you look at it on paper, it's exactly the way it should be. But the real world is, when we're going through redevelopment, we're looking at individual parcels. We're not looking at a whole block. So when we deal with the real world, and we talk about internal road systems, in most cases, we get pushback. People don't even want to put stub roads in, let alone put in roads. So, you know, maybe 100 years from now, this will come to reality, but what we're dealing with today is not anywhere close to what you're suggesting.
So Dal, this entire stretch, let's go back to the earlier photo here, hold on. This entire stretch is going to redevelop in the next 20 years, is my guess. You know, it's underbuilt now, it's got vast parking lots, you know, not a ton of investment in most of these buildings. So we're going to get them piece by piece. And if that means we only get a loop road that goes in on one property and goes across the back and then comes back out, you know, that's as much as we can get right now. I fully understand that. So these things are incremental and they happen over time. But without the regulation about where that connection goes, without having a minimum and a maximum of where that connection goes, we can't make the connection. So you have to start somewhere. These have to become places which are more connected. And so yes, in a lot of cases you're only going to get a stub, but then you're going to get the next guy over who eventually redevelops, and you'll connect the stub. And at a certain point then, you can close some driveways. We're not really talking about closing the driveways as a mandatory element here. What we're really saying is start building that backbone system.
And I understand that, Lee. And you know what, I'm in agreement with you, but the problem is unless you compel them to do it, and it's going to be difficult to compel them to do it, to put in stub roads, to put an internal road in.
It's not difficult. It's in your rules and it's a requirement.
Lee,
it's difficult to compel them to do it.
Lee, this is Ellen Cost.
You have to be committed to it.
Lee, this is Ellen Cost. Do you think it's possible, have you worked in any communities where communities have offered incentives for that sort of thing, like say they get a break on setback or landscaping requirements or some other kind of requirement?
Only where that is becoming a truly public street. But yes, I mean, certainly we've encountered people trying to offer inducements. But usually this is just, you know, this is just a part of the cost of doing development. If we were to look at the Lowe's site right now, which you guys built according to the new standards that were adopted in the last revision of your regulations, you'll see that site is fairly functional, and eventually we'll build this same kind of network that we're talking about here.
So to be clear, Lee, for a moment, that's the Lowe's off of Niagara Falls Boulevard is a Benderson development off of North Bailey, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The one with the landscape parking rooms,
right.
And that basically is set up for a more intense future.
Well, it's already approved in '97.
Now, we can certainly, you guys can continue the conversation about this topic, and you know, we can offer you anything that you feel you need. We have a number of client cities who have done these kinds of things in the past, and we can begin to see the establishment of some of these connections in other client communities just through incremental development. And you know, the minute there's a second one next to you, the system starts to make sense, and then it all kind of falls into place.
Lee, it's got, one of the current problems with the existing code, and something we would have to fix to do what we're proposing on the shallow lot, or even all the way up to the deep lot, is the current code does not allow access to local streets from commercial developments. It's become a problem because DOT is actually on board with us in the fact that, yeah, we should be discouraging the number of access points on these major roadways. But then turn around and our code says you can't go in off the side street. You know, that's a public street.
Yeah, I think that has to be reconsidered, certainly. You know, there's not a perfect edge on any one of your corridors.
No.
And you're always gonna get people who exercise their economic right to, you know, buy up land back behind and, you know, punch some additional commercial development back there with, you know, the town board's permission. So, yes, we have to begin to face the issue that all streets in the town are actually owned by all of the people in the town, and that therefore there ought to be a right to use.
Well, I don't disagree, but that's not what we got here currently.
You know, any example that you have that comes from New York State would probably be really helpful for us to kind of think about or use as an example, because my sense is that jurisdictions across the states change, and their ability to implement this stuff is different across the state. So any examples that you have or work that you've done in a New York State community that's had to deal with New York State DOT would be helpful.
Okay, so we'll look at that on our end. Would you maybe reach out to our supporting partner and see if they've been involved in any access management projects?
Personally, I have.
Who's the supporting partner?
Thanks, Serta.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure we're going to get much out of them, but I think if you're looking for some more localized guidance, then I'm guessing probably we go to DOT here. Honestly, probably 10, 15 years ago, we had a fairly successful, extensive discussion about access management, particularly along Transit Road, but with model provisions and some code for several of our roadways that exist today. I don't know if you've seen those. It might be useful to go back and look at those as you're thinking about this. We can take a look at that and see how some of that stuff might apply. And then at one time, DOT had some subject matter expertise within the department devoted specifically to access management. I don't believe that exists anymore.
Okay.
So we can dig around a little bit. It's a great principle for planning. It's a good organizing framework. It's been very difficult for us to implement.
Lee, this is Brian. What is the city of Buffalo doing with Green Code? Do you know offhand?
No,
okay.
I don't know, but we can find out.
I'm wondering what they did.
I think they did connections, the internal connections, but they didn't do anything related to the access management on the front end of the street.
Okay. And the state's already trying to force this in a number of circumstances, with or without your code. Edukids, Ryan pointed out.
Dental office.
The dental office.
That's the SOP for the state, right? You got your title to work in driveway.
This is Melissa, did the access management have to do with the use, like EduKids, because of fire codes and that sort of thing, or was it just,
no,
okay.
it was geometry. Hey Lee and Kevin, this is Brian. So, the DOT's forcing, you don't get a right to a curb cut just because it existed. So it's happened on Main Street within a mile of where we're talking now. happened at Edukids at Stoneham, near ECC, and it happened with, planned Gurdwara Center, further down heading towards Transit. They removed one of the cuts on Main Street. So, you showed Transit on there. That's already happened on both sides of Transit in Amherst and Clarence with any new development. So, for what that lends to conversation.
So if this becomes, I suspect what I'm seeing here is that access management becomes a primary organizing concept and framework for our suburban districts, then I think we're going to have a conversation with DOT and see how far we can take some of this and get a better understanding, even though we deal with this every month, mostly, a better understanding of where they are on access management and how far they'd be willing to let us run with this kind of thing. And I'm not trying to be discouraging or negative about it. I just know that this is a challenge for us. And if it becomes that organizing factor for the code.
And I'd say don't worry about closing the driveways. If you don't close the driveways and all you're requiring is the internal connections, I cannot see that there's any grounds to complain about the organization of development to mutual benefit. That's one of the things that, zoning is supposed to be doing. So, I mean, there isn't any reason, we're not proposing at this time to set any standards for closing driveways. But I can assure you, once a roadway network exists inside there, DOT is going to be really reluctant and is going to be asking people to consider closing driveways.
I don't.
I think that's fine. That's just the evolution of the place.
Yeah, I'm not doubting what you're saying. I'm just so we're going to have to. We'll do a little homework here on our end.
Lee, can I just? You have a great graphic up, which is Main and Transit. Now, let's assume that. Well, we know that it's all individual landowners, or several.
Yes.
It requires the planning department to pick and choose where should we put the primary internal access road.
So there, you could get by a long time without a real street in here, and if we never got a true street, we're only showing one street, really. We're showing access to the development off of Main, to the left where it says street, and then here in the center where it says street. But if all that was is a driveway in enough right-of-way, that would be just fine for right now.
I understand, but I guess my question is, at what point do we have to look at this on a parcel-by-parcel basis and say, this is where the internal east-west or north-south road's going to go? I mean, it requires a lot of advanced planning.
Well, so part of it is that by setting that maximum distance for the cross-access easement, material, you get it just kind of incrementally as a basis of the zoning. The streets cutting through, there is some, especially when it's an actual street section, there's going to be reluctance. But the second that, you go in and say, well, you don't actually get a right to a curb cut on the street unless you're providing a shared access, the first guy that redevelops is going to be like, I'll take it, please. Give me direct access, please. And they'll build it, and then they'll have to connect everybody else to it, just through stubs. And the next person isn't 300 feet away or whatever the distance is from that cross-access easement. He can't have a curb cut. He's got to connect to the stub.
Yeah, I think this is Scott. I think I'm kind of going where Dan was going. When you start looking at all these, intersections, nodes, whatever you want to call them, I mean, you almost pretty much have to look at every one of them on a parcel-by-parcel basis to figure out on this entire node where those access points should be for each individual one. For example, legally, I don't know what would happen, say that in the image you have up there currently, the street coming in off of Transit, which would probably be 4 lanes with some sort of central median to accommodate the throat. You're looking at 50 feet. What if that falls in the middle of one guy's 100-foot wide parcel?
then he's clearly not gonna build it, Scott. He's gonna build a portion of it, he may well build a half street or something else, or else, if you determine as a town that you have a great enough interest in it, you'll support him by taking some of that right away for him.
The folks that have done this, is there a kind of an access management overlay to their code, or a plan for these corridors that's put in place that the communities strive to execute?
I've never seen a drawn plan except as part of a DOT effort to close driveways and improve traffic flow. And that has been solely about closing driveway entrances. On the community-by-community basis, I have only seen this, as we've described it here, slightly more flexible system, in which there's kind of a minimum and a maximum, and, you find your way into that. Now, going back to Scott's question about if I got 100 feet and I'm supposed to give you 50 feet, Scott, that's a classic variance case there, where, he's gonna say, look, I cannot do this, I've got to vary from the standard. You're either gonna move the alignment of the street to make it make more sense, or you're gonna say it's gonna be a much smaller street. It's only gonna be 2 lanes in this case. But the main point is, if that is where there is an access point from your median cuts on that big road right now, that's likely to stay an entrance point. Now, yes, I think it'd be a great exercise to go through and try to pre-plan these, and you could even put those little pre-planned, ideas into the comprehensive plan if you chose to. It's pretty easy to figure out where this stuff should go. It's not rocket science. The implications for property owners, however, play out over time, and the plan may get modified, and that's just, real life of what happens during the application of these kinds of programs.
So Lee, this is Brian. We put this into the Main Street zoning in Williamsville, not as tightly, not very rigidly, but just sort of said access plan. Planning board's been able to work out. So if you right now went to the Bank of America building here and Alleyway Theater, there's at least the potential to snake around back there. All right. Well, then we've got a grade break that stops it from continuing to other parcels. It's not perfect, but it created that environment. But if you're looking at like fire access easements, there's all sorts of negotiated components that create this. And if you think about Transit Road, and you look at like North French right now, that plaza, you get pretty far in your non-transit access. And the same thing, you can pretty much get from Maple all the way up to Renaissance, almost all the way to Klein, but then we run into another grade break. And that crosses drainage ditch or a creek, because it's culverted, and you can get behind Lowe's Wegmans, you can get in front of Lowe's Wegmans, and then you can get again right parallel to the street.
Those are all things that were done.
Is that all Benderson?
With this stuff in mind.
No.
But it was all done with this stuff in mind. It's not anywhere to plot that battle along certain corridors.
They own their own facility.
So, yeah, you're right. I mean, it exists in some places.
That's fine.
With actually applying this with like a planning board, in the communities that have really like implemented this over a number of years, do they come up with specific easement language that has to be included, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, very typically. And I'm sure we can find some examples of cross-access easement language.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
I just had one observation, Melissa. The graphic that you had, or the overview of Maple, and I think it was Sweet Home, and where there was like a McDonald's and Buffalo Infusion and all these different businesses. I couldn't imagine anybody wanting to share access to McDonald's, for example. and the easement road right now, it's a new building, Buffalo Infusion and that dentistry just invested, and that access road crosses right through their building. So, those are just observations to think about. I mean, what do you do with fast food? Nobody wants all of that debris, nobody wants that traffic. That's just a thought about this specific image.
Hey Lee, this is Brian again. In the communities that were creating this, that became their fire access also?
It serves that function, yes.
Okay.
And
because that's what we do have.
Fire access can be done with 20 feet and at most 26 feet for the operator. So these aren't necessarily huge, but it is a question of being able to move along those parcels. And the challenge with this, particular shallow corridor example is really that by putting all of that parking in front, we have no throat as you go back into these sites, really, unless the individual property owner created it, right? So the turning movements are all, it's kind of the Wild West. There's the, there you go. So there's a piece right in that segment. There's not even any stripes on the property to the left of Cosmo Rock. I don't quite know what it is. It looks like a little Asian restaurant, although it says Brews out front. I guess it was an Asian restaurant and not a served beer. But there's no stripes in the parking lot. There's no median. There's no throat. You could drive up over that curb at just about any point. It's a pretty dangerous location. So controlling that, there are choices. Yeah, we could leave the connection in the front in this particular section if that's an alternative that seems to make more sense. But we need the connection is kind of the key thing. The improvement in the quality of traffic flow on the adjacent roadway is substantial.
Yeah.
Well, the additional benefit to having the backage road, or the situation with the throat, going to the backage road, you can even see kind of, a lot of these buildings are already set back with some service uses back there. If that was a connection, you can see how much more length and stacking you have before getting to the street. You can also imagine that these buildings might actually come a little bit closer to the street and not be set apart from the street by big asphalt. They might actually park beside their building.
Kevin, this is Brian Culp again. So when you want to set up the backage road, do you code that into your transitions so that you say, okay, look, I can't force everybody to connect your parking lots or your sites, but I can tell you that you're going to leave an offset of whatever we need for fire width off the back of your lot, so that after your screening, you've already got the real estate. So if you looked at your transitions, right, on a shallow lot or a deep lot, you were already in sort of the packet that we have here. We're showing protected district, and then we're showing wall or vegetation. Then you're showing vehicles. Am I reading this wrong? So then you're showing vehicles pulled parallel to that screening. I guess what I'm asking is, should those vehicles be pulled off, and after you have that wall and screening, should we then say, okay, we're going to leave 10 feet, what's the width you want there, 11, 20? Should we be leaving a 20-foot offset off of that screening so that, no matter what, the buildings are going to be pulled up, whether or not somebody paves that and puts asphalt down, we have the ability to in the future.
Yeah, and it's uniform.
Right, and then it's uniform.
So that works, but so here's part of the thing is, the reason that we have to do this at a district scale is because you can see the lots that have actually absorb some of the residential lots that go all the way through the block, that would not work. There's no residential transition, right? And so you would, that setback would just give you, it wouldn't give you the setback you're looking for. It wouldn't give you.
So let's stay on this. Stay on this graphic for a minute. So where you have the residential transition, and then you have the local, right? So the residential transition wraps the turn.
On the sides of the houses, but not on the street face, not on the local street face.
Yeah, I don't see
yes, if what you're
what's the problem. You're just bending around the building,
potentially.
potentially.
Going to want these guys moved off that back lot line. There's plenty of reasons to double dip with this roadway connection.
I know.
And whether they paved it or not, at least leaving it would be better than nothing else. So, for example, if you're going through some kind of variance proceeding or something else and the guy's getting relief, okay, maybe you don't make him pave it, but we should at least get the connection.
Yeah. In a circumstance like this, I would take the residential transitions, I think, and turn it where you hit. So is the local a transition type?
No, it's the road. It's the road classification. It's the road.
Okay, so the local's just. So, I mean, I look at this and I don't assume that we necessarily want a commercial faced out onto that into that residential local road, right? And I certainly don't want the back of the building faced out onto that residential road. So am I better off carrying the residential transition around parallel to the local road? And if so, and I create that 20-foot offset, then can I just snake the 20-foot offset around as well?
So there is a similar concept that we used in the center, right, where the center abuts that residential street, right? You get that dark green, and that's that residential transition. So you can see, can you see the mouse? So that dark green piece right there, that's a residential transition. We didn't want to require it on a shallow parcel because the capacity of the site is pretty limited and they're constrained. And so ideally we'd get this on that residential site as well. But, I mean, you can split zone these sites and say that's residential.
So what do you need from us in order to move ahead with coding for the suburban districts? Based on this conversation or maybe some subsequent research we do over the next week or so on access management or whatnot, what kinds of things you need from us in order to work on these districts?
Well, I think we're going to take a stab at it. I mean, basically, the timeline says we have to keep moving. And so, yes, I think at the same time, we need to be poking around, find some examples, and see if those are compelling enough to get you guys to keep some of these ideas in place. So we're going to move forward on the draft, I believe, and try and get that ready for your December meeting.
Okay. I mean, have you gotten useful input from us to this point on what you've been presenting, or is there any questions on your part right now? Okay, all right.
Yeah, I'm not surprised to hear any of the things that you're saying, and I'm glad you're getting them off your chest now, and we'll be talking about them again when you look at the details of the regulation and the kinds of flexibility that we might be able to build into.
Okay. Is this a good time to transition to the traditional discussion on the traditional districts?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, sitting in front of you are the transitional pages, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about the approach and some of the concepts.
So really, this is just outlining kind of the difference between suburban and traditional. Like, traditional context and conditions are that they're organized around older human-scale street network, a lot more connectivity. Safety along the streets hasn't so much been compromised by speed of the road and auto-oriented design. But, historically, you already have a fine-grained parcelization, and, these parcels are integrated by the framework that already exists today, that highly connected street network. So the conditions in a lot of these older traditional districts is that you have unique place identities, kind of with nuanced character changes along different streets and different street sections. And in some cases, those identities have been compromised by suburban-style development or, more contemporary strip mall type auto-oriented development. So part of this is part of the important part of this is to have people-oriented places and compatible transitions in the distinct neighborhoods, and then reinforce those nuanced character changes in the districts. And so you've got the code pages. This is just an example, and we can talk about all the different standards and how they work. Kind of talk about the different elements that would be regulated. But you'll notice that these are really based on parcel and type parcel standards. You don't need to know what your neighbor's doing in order to get this to work. So there's very little lot standard requirements. There's a 10% outdoor amenity space requirement that's new in this draft. That's just to get a little bit of something. It could be plaza, it could be accommodated as private outdoor amenity space. There's the build to zone that gets the building up at the street. You've got setbacks along common lot lines or alleys, and these change by districts. Parking setbacks ensure that you don't have the parking right up the street in your stream, and that's only where you're not required to already have building. You've got building height, and there's some nuance to building height here. We've got top plate height, which is essentially where your wall has to end and your roof has to start. That means that you can get, because your height is allowed an additional 10 feet above that, in this case, you can get a half story in the roof floor. And so we limit the maximum roof pitch to ensure that that's inside of a roof and not inside a wall pretending to be a roof. And the top plate height standard helps with that. We have a limit to the street-facing building length. In certain districts, this needs to be more fine-grained, and we allow some exceptions from that. We can talk about further on when we get into the rules of measurement, part 2 of this document. But it might say that you can continue your building in order to use the same elevator core, things so you have open air circulation between buildings, or as long as you provide enough of a courtyard that is perceived as a building break from the pedestrian perspective, then that might be enough to count as a building break. There's some minimum story heights. You see residential's required to be elevated a little bit. That's to continue to get eyes on the street and kind of passive surveillance, making sure things stay safe, while also providing sufficient privacy for those ground floor units. Transparency is about getting enough glass and windows on the, looking down on the sidewalk and activating that experience. Blank wall would be limiting the amount of blank wall, so you're not walking along tedious, inactive surfaces and buildings for too long. We have some nuanced rules around that we can talk about later. Pedestrian access, if you've ever walked along a building that's completely glass with no doors, you realize that it provides a certain amount of activation. You really need to have those doors that psychologically tell you, oh, people belong here. People use this sidewalk. And in some ways, it's more than psychological. If you don't have doors on the sidewalk, people won't walk on the sidewalk. So, entrance spacing is critical, and those entrances being facing the street. And then we also have some streetscape minimums. These would be above and beyond what is required by transportation. This is a traditional center. It's a place where people should be walking. So you can see there's some baseline standards. This isn't, massively gracious sidewalks and tree lawns, but it's enough to provide, sufficient space for two people to walk side by side, or, even three people to cross each other. But you can see that in our frontages you can see the village frontage. That's really something we use conservatively at key intersections and things where you really want to concentrate activities, is shop fronts. You know, lots of doors on the street, lots of windows, window traffic. So you'll see in this that the pedestrian access spacing is going to be a lot tighter. You're going to have more windows. Your streetscape is going to have a deeper sidewalk and a deeper streetscape, tree lawn, to make that walkable environment more comfortable, safer, and enjoyable. And so these frontages act as overlays on the standards that you can see in the base districts here. And a combination of that, so it gives us the base standards that give us good urban form and you know, building where it needs to be, things like that. And then this is how we get that nuanced character change, is through the frontages to be managed.
Calvin, is it safe to assume that the images that are given in each one of the districts accurately model the provisions that are given below? So essentially, if you're looking at these images, what you're seeing there is what results from the provisions and the distances and dimensions below.
I'm going to say yes, but Dan, because as you know, we did a round of revisions in just the last 2 days, and those may not be accurately reflected, but they would be before the final version. But yes, for the most part, these accurately reflect what the application of the rules would generate.
Okay.
And that's not to say that it's the bare minimum of those standards. For example, you look at residential frontage, and it's requiring 20% for upper stories, and you can see there's a lot of windows on that house. It's by no means the least amount of transparency you should be able to do on the front of your house, but it looks really good in the diagram. And, you know, and that's kind of aspirationally what we'd like. If you look at blank wall on that residential frontage, there's absolutely no way to show a 30-foot blank wall, which might be allowed on a side street of the residential frontage, a garage or something to that effect. But we have to be able to represent that in the diagram. So these aren't showing the worst development, but it is representing that to a certain degree in diagrammatically.
Can you explain how the frontages are applied and how they relate to the base districts?
Say that one more time.
Can you explain how the frontages are applied and how they relate to the base district, so folks understand the difference?
So the base district rules apply wherever the zone is mapped. If, in addition to the base zone, we find it critical to have a particular character, either the village frontage, the green frontage, or the residential frontage, are the ones we have currently for traditional, that is represented by what's on the ground today, the historic precedent. We would map those parcels with that frontage. And only in those cases. You don't want to overmap village frontage, because that means you're going to have a bunch of dead streetscapes, or people just won't develop. You'll have a lot of glass in places where they will, but it won't be activated. That's been a kind of a critical problem in places that saw a lot of development in the early 2000s. That we thought mixed use meant, shops on the ground and residential above absolutely everywhere. But in reality, we need to use that very conservatively, because it is asking a lot of the developer, and it really is about very special places, very special Main Street type places. The green frontage is something that's on the ground today. You see it in front of a lot of civic buildings, and if you were trying to continue that same character along with adjacent parcels, you have to map it there. Residential is really about what's on the ground today. Is it old houses that have been converted to offices, and we want to maintain that character along that direction? Map that on the ground. If you don't map it, if it's not there, then it's a critical element to transitioning to a sensitive neighborhood. And even then, it's going to be a challenge to get that built.
So one of the tasks the committee has is not only to ensure that we've mapped the districts correctly, we're going to have to decide where to apply these frontages, if it's appropriate, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Could I ask why we're looking at residential frontages at all?
Do you want to talk about that, the schedule question that goes with that?
Say that again, Lee, sorry.
Did you want to use that as a way to segue to the schedule question that kind of surrounds that?
No, I think we got a couple questions yet.
Okay.
Yes, well, I guess my first comment would be, I find this very difficult, having just gotten the documents tonight, to make thoughtful, to even have a thoughtful question. I would have liked to have some... Well, this is called a draft, but is this the draft?
What might something need you're not expected to review?
Okay, but the suburban information was not in paper form, but clearly there were slides and information, but we didn't have that in paper form, so I'm not sure that they haven't written versus this they have. What are we talking about? This is not actionable, we're just talking.
We're not taking any action on any of this. You're getting this for the first time, understood, and essentially what we're going to do is give a little introduction to what it is and ask you to take it and think about it a little bit and look at it, and we'll come back the next time and talk about it.
Thank you. That gives me some comfort. Then I have some questions said about why we're looking at residential when we're just supposed to be looking at commercial. I understand.
So,
I heard the word options, but this doesn't make sense.
Think about Harlem and Maine, where you have houses that come back from Harlem Road, south of Harlem Road, that are commercially used, and they have more residential frontage to them today. We want to maintain that style of frontage.
Like a home doctor's office practice, something like that.
So one of the things they're going to try to do is establish all the contexts, right? So some of the commercial buildings are going to have different commercial profiles based on where we want pitch roofs or mansards or where we want flat roofs. And we happen to have all these old legacy residential components down some of our commercial streets. We don't necessarily want to see, a two-story flat roof plunked in the middle of, a series of pitch roof former residents, and I think that's why.
Okay, because then I was looking at this and I understand this was sort of, 11th hour putting this together, but, accessibility alone, I don't understand the residential frontage.
Yeah.
And then I'm finding all of the images, I'm sorry to say, really underwhelming. There's no inspiration here at all to guide, and I think I would be concerned that a developer would look at this and take it literally, and, there's no breakage like we have now required, that 10-foot, facade breakage in the building. I don't see any of that.
More awnings, more arcades?
Not necessarily awnings, but I see monotony and GDR buildings. So that's what I have for now.
The only thing I can say about that is that these are intended to illustrate the provisions and the principles below. Yep, that's their purpose. It's not necessarily to suggest the building form. It's meant to illustrate how these things are used and measured and applied. So good comment, and somebody could take it that way. But Lee, you can comment on this if you want. But the real intent here is to just supplement the provisions and the dimensional stuff by illustrating how they're applied.
Well, so I have a question follow-up question along the same line. So at the end of the day, I'm looking at draft pages for, and I guess my question is, are we going to get into establishing the needs for cornices, the needs for traditional building ends? Are we going to be dealing with the location of signboards, traditional signboard location, proportional signboard location, fenestration pattern relative to neighboring parcels, alignment of those fenestration patterns, or is this sort of the graphic set? Does it dive deeper into that?
So, you're talking about a level of design standards that's not included here, including the articulation that was mentioned just a bit ago. Not that we don't know how to regulate those things, But we've just barely gotten to making sure that the urban form would be correct in this round. I guess I would be curious, Brian, would you anticipate using the site plan review process to improve those kinds of elements of buildings, or do they really need specific prescriptive standards? I realize Williamsville did employ prescriptive standards.
You know, I've been torn a little bit about this. I've thought about it in the past. One of the concerns I have is that without the prescriptive standards, then you can, really end up with some fairly blank facades that do meet letter of law with this. And then we don't have architectural review capacity at our planning board, so there is not an activation in which somebody gets to say, listen, you're not of right. You need to add some kind of awnings. You need to add some kind of overhang, some kind of fenestration break. You need to, your fenestration, you may mean the perfect transparency requirements and stuff, but if you look at the building next to you, your alignment's completely off because your floor-to-floors are totally different. I think in the traditional, when we're trying to match traditional context, especially in Snyder or outside the village in Williamsville, that we're going to need to be a little bit more prescriptive than what we have on paper. I think when we get into the Boulevard Mall area, that area that's sort of undetermined yet, and that we're not trying to match context, maybe we can dial back those prescriptions.
And that's one of the problems we've been suffering with on the planning board, because we have no control over that. And often when we're looking at site plans or we're looking at elevations of buildings, the adjacent buildings are completely different than what we're looking at today. We'd like to have input in that. We'd like to be able to have a little bit of control over that architectural design.
So, brother, to take that a step further, Dale, if I said, planning board, we're going to give you architectural review capacity, yes? Okay.
Yes. We've been fighting for that for as long as I've been on the planning board.
All right.
In response to Brian and Dale's concerns, this is getting back to what we're doing here, is getting rid of basically what is their current Part 5 of Part 4 of the zoning ordinance, which is the commercial districts. There are supplemental design standards within those. Were we deleting those or moving those into, I think it's new Part 7? This is where the arcades...
Scott, but it appears that there are people who are interested in retaining those or similar concepts in a prescriptive manner. If traditional seems to be surviving initial, pass, we should be rescuing those and layering them on and talking about what the implications of those are towards improvement of the business. We'll not ever in zoning be preparing guidelines, so they won't be, should or may or whatever. They will always be must.
Yeah.
But we can provide flexible standards, like things like these percentages and other things, which are an absolute measurable thing, but the design of them is within the hands of the architect.
Yeah. For example, in Part 4 right now, it's like a minimum percentage of the building. You got to have transparency, plus in that part, there's requirements for awnings or covered entries, things of that nature. I think
yes, we hadn't gotten that far, but yes, we should be looking at all those elements, I think, very specifically in the traditional environment.
Yeah, so they probably should get carried forward into regulations applying to all districts or whatever that Section 7 was going to be called.
Yep.
Okay.
we'll go back through those, Scott. And in fact, I think we should go back through the Williamsville example as well.
Are we going back to the Williamsville example? Sorry. Okay. So, no, so I guess, at the end of the day, if we had an architectural review board, we would want to give some minimum prescriptive standards so that somebody didn't feel they were walking into that review board and got blindsided, with material change-outs or whatever else. But, you know, I would tiptoe in this a little bit. I would say that if we're going to keep a suburban coding or a suburban center or suburban corridor, I may be a little less concerned about some of that when it gets into the traditional. So I'm thinking, you know, the Squire building, right? The Squire building changes owner. You know, the building's a mess inside. You know, it's just cobbled together. Somebody says, I want to rebuild that. You know, I'm going to be pretty prescriptive about what they do there. I don't think I want to just leave that to chance. And I want the planning board or an architect, either the planning board or standalone architectural review board, to dial into that and say, we're going to get this right before we sign off on this thing. And, okay.
Yeah, I would say in large projects right now that come before us that are in this limbo land are picking and choosing from the code that we have versus the comp plan and putting up massive construction saying that it has the stories that the comp plan likes. It doesn't look very good. It's cramming a lot of nonsense in, and it has no, but it does have some prescriptive things that they are even trying to dial back, but at least they're there to have some sort of oversight on what it looks like. Otherwise, it would just be square buildings maxing out the height, filling out the lot as to maximize their profit.
All right. So Lee, I don't know if that cuts into the question about whether or not we want to be prescriptive enough for you to try to figure out how that's going to affect future drafts here or not.
Well, we'll certainly continue that conversation. I think we've got to decide what the prescriptive elements will be first. That procedural piece of you know, the creation of and if there were a separate body or the enabling of the planning board to review some of those kinds of things is fairly easy to do in terms of the code language. It's kind of hard to talk about. So we'd probably have to have this committee tackle that again further at some point in the future.
All right.
Anything else on this, Lisa? What would you like us to do with this draft over the next couple weeks?
Mark it up with you know, questions or concerns. Share those during a future meeting so that we could have sort of a consolidated set of comments, and we're glad to, you know, help respond to comments. But basically, we want everyone to, you know, ask their questions now as this begins to move forward.
Lee, Daniel Wachowski, I'm just going to make a suggestion. When we have two graphics on one page, it gets busy, and maybe color code the letters to help the reader find the letter on the graphic. Just a thought.
Okay.
May I request access to your slides? Do we have access to those? And will we be getting a paper form to, okay. And will we be getting...
To have the slides. We've not, the slideshow was produced shortly before the presentation. I apologize for that. But we'll make those available as well.
Thanks. I think that would ease some note-taking in the future, knowing that they were on their way after the fact. And we will be getting paper versions, or at least an e-version of the suburban draft that we saw today, correct? Okay, thank you.
So, let's get done with this. Lee, we're just going to drop down to item 4 here, which is actually the future committee meetings and schedule, and just kind of see. So, our next scheduled meeting is the 12th.
And we'll listen in and follow the conversation.
Yeah, well, our next meeting is the 12th, as it's scheduled today. So, for us to try to continue to meet the time hacks we have here, what exactly would you like us to be prepared to provide to you, either prior to the 12th or on the evening of the 12th? What would be best for you?
So, we're hoping to have district pages for the suburban areas to begin that portion of the conversation.
Okay, do you want to deal with comments on the traditional districts at the same time, or do you want to?
I think that would be welcome. We could introduce the suburban pages and then discuss any significant issues about the traditional pages. You know, we've got to get through both of them relatively quickly, so I think that's fair game. Okay,
so I'm going to ask folks on the committee. So it might be more efficient for you to deal with comments on the traditional districts if you had those before the meeting. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
So if we set a deadline for folks to have a look at these and provide any comments or questions they might have, to the extent that you can in writing prior to that, and then we can ship those off to Code Studio prior to the meeting on the 12th. Is that reasonable? Everybody give me a north-south on that one? We're good? Okay, so I don't have a calendar. We'll set a date for that internally. We'll shoot it out to folks, and again, so the idea is please take some time, look at the traditional districts, mark them up. Obviously we have the ability to consolidate those to the best of our ability and scan that off to Code Studio, so you'll have it prior to the meeting, Lee, and maybe you'll have an opportunity to look at them before we discuss those that evening. And then we'll expect the suburban districts in draft form sometime prior to that meeting. Might be shortly before, I guess, but we'll spend some time talking about traditional stuff, and we can talk some more about the suburban stuff. Is that reasonable?
That's correct.
Okay. So, let's talk about the 19th of December, which is the following week. What's the general consensus on the part of the committee? That's a 1 week time period between meetings.
I'm conflicted that day, so.
Okay, so it sounds like the 19th, I got 2 folks that are thinking the 19th is going to be tough now. We'll probably get more hands. Yeah, so the 19th may not be feasible. The next time we could schedule to talk about this is early January. So we can talk a little bit more about what might be done in the interim, but it sounds like the 19th is probably not feasible. Would we be better off meeting on the 19th instead of the 12th? Let me ask that. We don't need it. Okay, so we're going to stick with the 12th. Looks like the 19th is probably not going to happen. So just so you know where we're going with that, Lee, everybody understands what we'd like to have. We'll set a date for comments prior to the meeting on the 12th. All right, I'm going back to Kim.
Okay, so kind of what Lee was alluding to a little bit was the mapping portion of what your work is going to consist of. As we are going through now, we'll have the traditional districts in hand. Next meeting, we'll have the suburban. We'll have looked at those for about a month or so. We're thinking that possibly in January, maybe on a Saturday, maybe it's in the evening, I'm not sure exactly, but we want to have some sort of kind of like a workshop. If you were on the committee previously, we did one of these at Sweet Home, middle school, middle school, I think. We want to try to start to get that mapping going. And I think a workshop where we're focused on that for a longer period of time may be a better solution, and kind of adding that workshop in addition to our meetings. I know it's a lot to ask, but I think the mapping is a pretty important portion of this project. So I'm not sure what your thoughts are. We offered up 2 dates there. It's like the 12th and the 19th of January on a Saturday morning, possibly, just to sort of kind of get that working.
I think the 19th is the Saturday of Martin Luther King weekend. We're hoping to get some younger families. I think there's going to be some people probably going out of town. So I would shoot for the 12th personally. And I think if we're going to do that using an elementary school, might give some parents, or at a middle school may give an opportunity to try to draw out some younger crowds. Oh, internal.
Yeah.
Internal. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. Never mind.
What you know about the districts now, and
I got it.
Public will be participation probably starting in late January, having a bunch of meetings for that as well.
I didn't hear the beer comment. What? Okay. Where are you holding your committee workshop? At the Irishman. Okay. So then, yeah, I would shoot for the 12th.
Well, we'll get details out to you once we can find a good location, but you're thinking maybe we used Sweet Home last time. They have a large room there with a screen, got tables in there.
This crowd, yeah.
We'll look at different locations, but.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess we skipped number 1, but I sent out the meeting notes, I think, twice. Does anybody have any comments on the meeting notes from the last meeting?
No. So I guess, are there any comments on the minutes? I would I'll motion to accept the minutes. All in favor? Okay. Yep. Okay.
We're set, unless you want to hang loose.
I'm glad to go home.
Okay. All right. All right, so we'll open it up for public comment. Don, pass this.
My name is Don Smith. First of all, don't take this as criticism of the committee. I understand the work you're doing is difficult. I understand it's hard, and I understand it's important. I understand it takes time, and I understand it's a draft process. I've even learned an awful lot about the details of what you're doing here, in terms of suburban and traditional and setbacks and everything. I've listened quite intensely. Mm-hmm. But the one thing that occurs to me, that I'm sort of the only guy here from the public. I feel awful lonely here.
Yes.
And I would like to see more of a full public here, but I don't see that happening. The only way I found out about this meeting was to studiously go through the town website and the Track Us part of it. I got the Track Us Now bookmark, so I look at it every day, probably twice a day, to see what's changed.
Okay.
And so right now, I don't think at this point in time there's an awful lot of public information about your process here going out so it can be observable. Just so you know, on the town website, and I'm very well of that, and frankly, for the thing, I'm the chairman of the IT Advisory Committee now. Mm-hmm. Okay. That happened last time we met. That the last information posted as a video of your operations was November 2017. This is now November 2018. I know of at least 2 meetings that have been videoed that have not been posted. I know there's information probably that's available that the public could look at, and I'm speaking as a member of the public here now, only as a member of the public. And that, I think, is something I just don't quite understand why we haven't seen it. So my question to you is, when are we going to have it?
So, I don't know, that...
Well, I looked last week, yeah. But it must have put up in the...
Okay, so they're up now.
Oh, so they're up now, okay.
Yeah.
All right. that covers one of my questions.
Perfect, okay.
Okay, so that sort of thing. And so, the other thing is I know this is your working materials are only draft materials, and could be changed easily over time. I appreciate the comments of certain members here about the quality of the information they got to look at in terms of how it looks. It's very difficult to follow, especially from any distance. It's hard to see from over here and see and understand from, I noticed that one graphic had a gray that was not gray and all that sort of thing. So I think the quality of your work is going to depend on the quality of the displays you're going to get, and I think asking for better quality information to you is very important. It's a very important thing to do. That's going to help you, hopefully. I have also other comments I would love to at some point get involved with, but I think they go into the substance of what you're doing, and since it's a draft operation, the substance probably has to wait till we get to the public parts of this process, whatever that happens to be. So the only thing I'm trying to advocate for here is for a greater awareness of the public to see what you guys are doing at your meetings.
Okay.
And I'd like to see that happen in a way that makes it more likely to happen, other than just to track us part of the website, which, by the way, it's one of the things I've had a comment on to the IT web developer, saying that it's somewhat hard to get at, considering the last time you had the website up, Track Us was right in your face, right there, you could see it. Now you got to go look for it. And frankly, for some of the older members of your community, not the younger members, they have a little bit harder time finding it. Okay? So that's my comment. So I would like to thank you for your work. I appreciate it, but I think there's more you can do to make the public aware of what you're doing.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Seeing no further public comments, I'm going to motion to adjourn the meeting.
Do we have a due date for comments?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, we were sitting here waiting for that, so that they could put together the compilation of our comments.
We're going to look at the calendar, and we'll come up with a date, email it to you within the next day, so please get us your comments by this date.
Okay. No problem. So I'm going to motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor? And now that we're adjourned, I'm going to just say, so some of the content that we were talking about with regards to the sort of drilled down detail work, the prescriptive stuff that Williamsville that's online. Williamsville's got 3 quasi form-based codes. I'm going to ask Dan when we send out that email regarding comments, to also send out the link to those codes, because as we're looking through this content, obviously if we're talking about, especially in the traditional area, having some of those things, we have to start paying attention to like signboard placement and stuff like that. I don't want to take for granted that everybody knows exactly what I'm referring to with some of that, so you'll see, those are fairly simplistic codes to follow, but they should give you a range of, here's all of the drilled down stuff that we're also going to need to bring into play. Make sense? We started from scratch. We took typical village buildings and started to kind of model based on those. But you'll see references to other communities and other buildings. We simply use photos, appropriate, inappropriate, point to placement of things. There's a second set of village codes that I want to get into right now, which is a design standard for historic places. So we have 32 historic properties, locally landmarked properties. And what we were finding is that this type of code couldn't apply to those, because you'd have somebody trying to put the wrong window or fenestration in a 1812 Italianate or an 1856 Italianate. Sorry, wrong vintage. So we went through and said, if you have an Italianate, here's your style. If you have a Neo-Gothic, here's your style. We just kind of went through all of those. Those were relegated just to landmark facilities, so I'm not going to try to commingle that. But the codes themselves, there's a MU, an NMU, neighborhood mixed use, and an R3M they're very kind of simplistic codes, but that's what produced Main and Hirschfield. So, that was architectural review board known for its scrutiny, and that project got through really in one planning board meeting, so. No, architectural review is the planning board has architectural review capacity. I could see a reason to create separate architectural review board and have that separate from planning board, so you're not holding up site plan review every time we get into an architectural, piece, but you can segment the two at the planning board level, so it could be a single board. I think that's a conversation we should have, and ultimately, if the planning board is interested in architectural review capacity, that's something that I would advocate for with my board, so I think that's something we have to strongly look at as a group. Somebody's got to police the detail, so, okay, great. Okay, all right, thanks everyone.